Let me welcome you back for the third of the first 3 weeks and remind you that we'll be resuming the course 2 weeks from now with the second 3-week set. And if you've got an outline before you, there's copies available in the back. You'll see that tonight's subject is marriage with passion, how sex should help a marriage, and why it sometimes doesn't anyway, maybe often doesn't is a bit pessimistic. We're striving for a biblical view of marriage. And so tonight, specifically, a biblical view of marital sex, or sex as a part of marriage. So let's begin by thinking most fundamentally about the fact that, according to Scripture, there are 3 purposes given for sexuality within marriage, which, of course, biblically speaking, is the only legitimate place for sexuality. So we don't have to say 3 purposes for sex in marriage. We can just say 3 purposes for sex. And speaking from Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, we can say that the first given purpose in the Bible for sex is the obvious one, at least one obvious one, to populate the earth. This is a direct commandment from God, at least to Adam and Eve. It was a commandment. God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth," with this purpose, to subdue it and to rule over it. Well, this is one of the places in which it was not good for man to be alone. Man needed a helper for this particular mission, which was to fill the earth. And, of course, sexual activity is involved in obedience to the commandment to be fruitful and to populate the earth. So the first purpose of sex is to populate the earth. And then the second one, and this comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 7, among other places, the second purpose of marriage, of sex in marriage, is to prevent immorality. To prevent immorality. And Paul says so in 1 Corinthians 7 when he says in verse 2, "But because of immoralities, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband." And you understand the sexual innuendo there. Paul is talking about the possibility of a man not touching a woman, that is, not being involved with a woman sexually, but because of immoralities, let each man have his own wife, and he means specifically let him have her sexually, and let each woman have her own husband, that is, sexually. And then later on in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 9, picks up on the same idea, that sexual activity is ordained by God as a means of preventing immorality. He says in verse 9, "If they do not have self-control," that is, if a man or a woman do not have self-control, "let them marry. It's better to marry than to burn." That is, it's better to marry than to burn with lust, which could easily lead to sexual disobedience, sexual activity outside the confines of marriage. There is a third purpose of marriage, of sex in marriage, and it's harder to put an exact definition to, because it has to do with the mystery of the thing. The mystery of the thing has a lot to do with the fascination that the world has for sexual activity in all of its proper forms and all of its perversions as well. We can say it this way: the third purpose of sex in marriage is to promote intimacy, but I don't like how clinical and therapeutic it sounds, for we're not talking about anything clinical or anything very anything very down to earth here. We're talking about something mysterious. And the references I give you only hint at the intimacy that is promoted by the sexual union of a man and a woman. Genesis chapter 4, verse 1 hints at it. The very first mention of sexual activity is the sexual activity between the first couple, Adam and Eve. It says in the Bible that the man knew his wife. And the verb to know is a euphemism. It's a way of politely talking about the sexual union, but the very fact that the verb know is the one that God would choose to describe the union between the husband and the wife indicates something of the intimacy that's available to a couple through sexual activity. Adam came to know his wife in a way he had not known her before by being sexual with her. So the choice of words used to discuss politely the subject indicates that there's some intimacy or some oneness to be attained on a mysterious level, on an otherworldly level through this activity. So similarly with Ephesians chapter 5 and the marriage analogy, that is the fact that a husband in his love for his wife resembles Christ in his love for the church. The Apostle Paul quotes from Genesis. He says, "For this cause a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave to his wife. The two shall become one flesh. This mystery is great." Now we've already looked at that and saw that to some degree the mystery pertains to the union between Christ and the church. But the fact that the union between Christ and the church is symbolized by the union between a husband and his wife lets us know that there is a mysterious element to the sexual relationship, and something going on that words fail to describe in the most intimate aspect of the relationship between a man and a woman. That is the sexual intimacy that is available to married couples. And where the intimacy comes from is well worth thinking about and not particularly worth talking about. The intimacy that comes between a man and a woman when they're having sex, legitimately blessed by God, has to do with the meaning of nakedness. It has to do with the meaning of pleasure. It has to do with the significance of giving and receiving pleasure. And because we're talking exclusively, by the will of God, about a husband to his wife and a wife to her husband, then you can believe that the specific purposes of marriage are being fulfilled in some specific way in the intimacy that's being experienced in the sexual union. So to a man, the intimacy that is available to him through sexual activity with his wife has to do with his need for respect. And for the wife, the intimacy that's available to her with her husband in the sexual expression has to do with her need for love. So it is, for the husband, a way of proving to his wife and expressing to his wife his love for her. And it has to do with the wife's ability to express respect for her husband. The very meaning of being male, the very meaning of being female is rolled all up in this as well. But as we talk about this, as we talk beyond the plain biology of the fact that babies come into the world this way, and the plain morality of the fact that adultery can be prevented, when we try to talk about the mystery that is going on between a husband and a wife in sexual activity with each other, and talk about the fact that it supplies the woman with what she needs the most, love, and the man with what he needs the most, respect, we're already up against the problem or the essential difficulty that couples will experience in this part of their marriage. And this points to why it is that sex should help a marriage and sometimes it doesn't. The fact is, the basic problem is, it's not the same thing. Now, that's what to fill in the line. The basic problem that sexual activity presents to a married couple is that it's not the same thing for a man as for a woman. It's not the same thing for a woman for a man. Take the basic need of a husband, the basic need of a wife as an illustration, and there are many other illustrations of the fact that however mutually satisfying sex is within marriage, however agreeable the couple can be about its place in the marriage, they will not be agreeing, they will not be satisfied for the same reason. They can't, because they are not the same gender, they are not the same people. We can see the differences between sex to a man and sex to a woman on every level, however you look at it. Think for a minute about the basic way in which a boy learns about the facts of sex when he's growing up and becoming a man, and compare it to what a woman learns, what a girl learns about sex as she's growing up. Now, typically, a boy comes across all kinds of information on the subject from the very earliest age. However he comes across it, whatever street corner he hangs around on, he hears from his peers and from his friends all sorts of things about sex. And without exception, practically without exception, what he hears from his friends is all positive. All the propaganda is positive. Now, a lot of it's not true. A lot of it is absolute falsehood, but it's all got a positive tone to it. A boy does not grow up hearing anything yucky about sex. A girl, on the other hand, gets, I think, from the very beginning, a very mixed message. She is likely to come across all sorts of positive propaganda as well, all sorts of falsehoods and overstatements about how glorious and wonderful this aspect of life is, but in the other ear, at the same time, is likely to be hearing all kinds of other stuff, all kinds of alarming and depressing and even horrifying messages about the subject. So that it stands to reason, all else being equal, that on the day of the wedding, on the wedding night, when the bridegroom and the bride show up at their place of marriage, you've got one person with an entire wealth of propaganda behind him, all positive, and another person who's got a very mixed message from a lifetime of hearing behind her. And that is just one of the many illustrations you can get to of how very different sexuality is to a man and to a woman. If they get to the place where they agree on it, they're not agreeing for the same reasons. They're not finding into the same sorts of things. You can think about the sexual differences between men and women on a physiological level, not the obvious anatomical differences, but the physiological differences in terms of sexual response. Man can be compared in his sexual response to a light bulb with a simple on-off switch. A man is on and then he's off. He's on and then he's off, and it can be very quick to be on and very quick to be off, like a light bulb. And a woman is not like that at all. So a woman is like something else. A woman's like an iron, which takes a long time to warm up, and then a long time to cool down, sometimes. Or you could compare a man to a light bulb with very good wiring, and the switch turns on and off very quickly. The woman is like an iron, but with faulty wiring, so that at times the on switch doesn't particularly work at all, and at times it works only for a while. The differences are subtle, but that's a difference too, because there's nothing very subtle about a man's sexuality, and there's a lot subtle and complicated about a woman's sexuality. So I think it would be good and worth our while to try to summarize what is the basic description of sex from a male perspective and compare it to the basic understanding of sex from a woman's perspective, line them up together and say, okay, so then generally speaking, to a man it's this, whereas to a woman it's this. So let's try to do that. I'll speak to the men first. I'm better at this. To a man, primarily, sex is a physical appetite. Primarily, I say. For anyone but the most animalistic man can see more to sex than just the satisfying of an appetite. But women, I serve you notice, primarily to a man, in the first place to a man, sex is a physical appetite. It belongs in his mind as he compartmentalizes life alongside eating food when he's hungry and sleeping when he's tired and drinking when he's thirsty and exercising when he feels like exercising. When he's hungry, he wants to eat. When he's tired, he wants to sleep. We're really very simple creatures. When he's thirsty, he wants to drink. And when he's feeling friendly, he wants to have sex. It's an appetite to be satisfied. There is some component of a similar sort to a woman. There is a sense in which sex is a physical appetite for a woman. But you cannot consider it a physical appetite for a woman the way you consider it a physical appetite for a man. Because to a woman, I think, it's not primarily a physical appetite at all. I speak from secondhand experience. To a woman, it's not physical at all. I mean, sex in marriage is an emotional thing, not a physical thing. And it's not particularly an appetite that asks to be satisfied. Rather, it is a possible experience that could be experienced. So if we're going to compare a man involved in sexual activity to someone, a human being eating a meal because he's hungry, we must look for another analogy to describe what is going on in a woman's mind, in a woman's inner person, when she is involved in sex. We have to think not about physical things, but about emotional things. We need to think about an experience rather than an appetite. So let me give you one illustration. You could come up with other ones that are perhaps better, no doubt better. Another emotional experience that you could compare the sexual experience from a woman's perspective to is the emotional experience of having a good long cry at the end of a really terrific movie. Crying at the end of a great movie, Gone with the Wind or something, is an emotional experience if it works at all. If it happens at all, there is this great outpouring of emotion because of the experience that has just been experienced throughout the whole duration of the movie. You might not be a person who cries at movies. You might not understand those who do, in which case the analogy won't do you any good at all. But if you can think of a happy emotional experience, an all-encompassing emotional experience, then perhaps you have something with which you can compare the sexual side of marriage from a woman's perspective. Now, if you think about the fact that a couple, a man and a woman, are never more intimate with one another, never more vulnerable towards one another, never more transparent with each other than when they are having sex, and you realize that what the man is doing is primarily satisfying a physical appetite in a way that God has blessed, but that's not what the woman is doing, you begin to see at once how it can very easily be that sex does not promote the intimacy or the bond that it's supposed to supply. Because while they are striving for the intimacy that is right in marriage and striving in the right circumstances for it, that is with one another, they're not striving for the same thing. One is striving to satisfy an appetite while the other is striving to experience certain emotional things. And on it goes. If you line up the two possibilities and think of eating a meal and crying at a movie, these things are different enough that you can imagine and begin to develop an understanding of how different it is for the man and for the woman, and how unlikely it is that they will quickly and naturally work everything out. I mean, this is the great lie of Hollywood and the great lie of the highbrow pornographic industry. Never mind the lowbrow pornographic industry, but the highbrow pornography that says sex is the most wonderful and most fulfilling and the most exhilarating aspect of life. The lie about that is that it completely departs from the reality of how much work there is involved in a man and a woman understanding each other enough to achieve the intimacy in a mutual way, given all the differences. I think it's probably true to say in general terms that very often a husband and a wife never do catch on to the implications of all these differences. And so what has been given by God as a source of intimacy, what ought to be like glue in a marriage, in fact turns out to be a separating or a dividing issue. As if the glue comes out of the tube and it hardens and then becomes a wedge that keeps these two people apart rather than a source of bonding that holds them together. There's just all kinds of ways for a man and a woman to misunderstand each other on a sexual level because they're looking at the same thing from a different perspective and with different motivations. One of the classic conflicts between a husband and a wife on sexual issues that comes out of the difference between a man's view and a woman's view is the quality-quantity debate. A woman seeing sex in marriage as an emotional thing and an experiential thing really only has a mind towards the quality of it. What matters is what goes on during the experience, the quality of the experience. But a man, considering at first a physical appetite, is primarily firstly concerned with the quantity of the thing, how often it happens. And a prophet of our age, a godless prophet, Woody Allen, has lots to say about the subject, and one of the places he says it most pointedly is in the movie Annie Hall, which is now, when I first started telling people about this, it was a current movie, and now it's an old movie you can find in a video store if you look hard enough. It won the Best Picture back in the 70s. Annie Hall is a story about a relationship. It's not a sanctified movie. It's not about a marriage relationship, except it is because it's a man and a woman created by God both trying to relate to each other on a sexual level. So pardon the immorality for a minute. Let me tell you a clip from the movie. Woody Allen and Diane Keaton are the husband figure and the wife figure in the movie, and the relationship is in trouble. So they go off for counsel. That's a biblical thing. They go off for counsel, trying to make this sound like it's more legitimate than it is. He goes off to a Freudian psychologist, so he's lying prostrate on a couch, and a little man with a goatee and a monocle is talking to him with taking notes on a clipboard. And she goes to a counselor, so she's sitting across a coffee table from a woman with a long skirt. And the screen is split, so you can see them both getting counsel on the same subject at the same time. And the counselor and the psychiatrist, with their lips synchronized, say to the husband in one place and the wife in another, "And how often do you have sex?" Now that question to a woman is a very different question than that question to a man. But in both cases you can see by the miracle of modern technology the same question being asked to the same people at the same time. And then we go to full face on Woody Allen, and he says, representing all husbands everywhere, "How often do I have sex?" He says, "Oh, hardly ever. I'd say 3 times a week." Then full face to Diane Keaton, representing all wives everywhere. And she says, "How often do I have sex?" "Oh, constantly. I'd say like 3 times a week." There's some wisdom in that. Because 3 times a week is evidently the national average. If anybody cares about these things, 10 times a month or 3 times a week is the national average for married couples. I don't know how meaningful that statistic is. But if that's true, take any couple in which it's true, that your average man's view of that average would be hardly ever, 3 times a week. And the average wife's view of that would be constantly, 3 times a week. Because the woman, for example, doesn't go to a movie and expect a good, satisfying cry 3 times a week. If she sees the movie and has a long cry, she might think of renting the movie again, 1998 or 1999, and crying again. But she's had the experience. And a man, on the other hand, having eaten a good meal, does think about what's for dinner tomorrow night. So we've got this division of understanding. And the quality-quantity debate is not an insignificant one. There's no mathematical answer to it. Because what the man is looking for is more than just the satisfying of an appetite, but he has an appetite to be satisfied, which demands a certain quantity. And when he listens to his wife in her concern about the whole thing being wrapped up in romance and meaningful expressions of true love, he could honestly plead, well, if you want to upgrade the quality, you got to upgrade the quantity. They go together. But she would say, if the quality was upgraded, why bother with quantity? I mean, we don't watch this movie every single night, do we? The question you could ask on a more theoretical level is, why did God make us like this? Why are husbands and wives so likely to disagree on such a fundamental issue? Why did God make us like this? There's 2 answers for that tonight. The first answer is, He didn't. This is not what God has done. This is what sin has done. A man's sexual appetite and the frequency with which he is able to expend energy towards the satisfying of this appetite has a lot to do with the way God made him, but it also has a lot to do with what sin has done to ruin him. Solomon in the Bible is a man who, technically speaking, could have any woman he wanted. He was king. He was also a good-looking man with a neat chariot. He could have any woman he wanted. So he married whenever he felt the impulse. And the records show that he married 700 times. Now you understand this is polygamy we're talking about, 700 times all at once without any divorces. And what's interesting, and I think at least to a woman alarming, is that while in the process of collecting 700 wives, he accumulated 300 concubines. Women kept on hand for purely sexual purposes until it rounded off at the number 1,000, and then being a neat and tidy kind of person, he stopped. What is equally alarming is that Solomon's harem was not noted for its immensity. Other kings in other civilizations in those days, who also could have any woman they wanted, had far larger harems. And in their wickedness and cruelty, a la Romans 1 and 2 and 3, regularly slaughtered the whole harem and started over again, another 2,000 or 3,000 women. Man's capacity to abuse this physical appetite God has given him is enormous. And a woman's difficulty with responding to her husband's sexuality, with even thinking of keeping up, has to do partly with the way God has made women, but also with a woman's sinfulness. So if there is a solution to the difficulties that are often found in the sexual part of marriage, it will have to do with God's ability to create virtue where there is no virtue. And that's why I have listed for you here the possibility of putting down two specific virtues, one for the men and one for the women. Call these sexual virtues. The Bible is clear on them. And although the Bible addresses at least one of them to both men and women, the way most marriages run, one is particularly necessary for the women to pick up, while the other is necessary for the men. So let's start with the sexual virtue that men must lead out with in their marriage, and it's 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, and verses 1 to 8. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 1 to 8. Paul the Apostle says, "Finally then, brethren, we request and exhort you in the Lord Jesus, that as you receive from us instruction as to how you ought to walk and please God, just as you actually do walk, that you may excel still more. For you know what commandments we gave you by the authority of the Lord Jesus." And then speaking again with the authority of the Lord Jesus, who is the Lord of marriage and the Lord of sexuality and the Lord of all creation, he says, "This is the will of God, your sanctification." That is, your being set apart for the purposes of God. That is, that you abstain from sexual immorality, that each of you know how to possess his own vessel, that is, control his own body in sanctification and honor, not in lustful passion like the Gentiles who do not know God, and that no man transgress and defraud his brother in the matter, because the Lord is the avenger in all these things, just as we also told you before and solemnly warned you. For God has not called us for the purpose of impurity, but in sanctification. Consequently, he who rejects this is not rejecting man, but the God who gives his Holy Spirit to you. The specific command that the Apostle Paul is speaking of rejecting, and in doing so you reject God who gives his Holy Spirit to you, is the command to self-control. Verse 4, each of you know how to possess his own vessel or control his own body in sanctification and honor. So the virtue that God will breathe into and allow a man to develop, which will help him in regard to the sinfulness of his own sexuality, is self-control. The virtue which he must cultivate is self-control. Well, good news, self-control is a standard part of the fruit of the Spirit. It's number 9 in the 9 aspects of the fruit of the Spirit. Self-control is what the Holy Spirit produces in the life of anyone who is filled with the Spirit. And it pertains to every aspect of life, and so pertains to the sexual aspect of life. A man particularly is called to be self-controlled in his responses, in his attitude, in his actions, and in his thinking about his wife. And there is, of course, another side to it. So for women, there is a virtue as well. And the virtue is mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And although Paul goes out of his way, I would say, to explain that it is necessary for both men and women to show this virtue, in most marriages, men do not need encouragement this way, and women do. The virtue is self-sacrifice, or sexual submission. Call it self-sacrifice. And listen to God speaking through the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. "Now concerning the things about which you wrote, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. That is, it's good for a man not to sexually arouse a woman. But because of immoralities, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband." And so you don't miss the point. Paul says it over again several times. Let the husband fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Please understand the very specific nature of these instructions. Paul is being polite about it. He's not using graphic language, but he's distinctly speaking about sex. In verse 1, certainly, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. This is not talking about shaking hands in the foyer. This is talking about sex. In verse 2, let each man have his own wife. He's talking about sex. In verse 3, let the husband fulfill his duty to his wife. He's talking about sex. And so the man has a sexual duty to his wife. It is to be available to her, to meet her sexual desires, and it is a duty. And similarly, a wife has a duty to fulfill to her husband of a similar sort. It is to to satisfy his sexual desires. So then in verse 4, when Paul says the wife does not have authority over her own body, he's very specifically talking about sexual authority. And the husband does not have sexual authority over his own body, but the wife does. In both cases, they are in charge of each other's sexuality to some clear and direct degree. So then in verse 5, he's still talking about the same subject when he says, stop depriving one another. That is, stop depriving one another of sexual opportunity, except by agreement for a time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again, lest Satan tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now there in the very last verse, the very last phrase of verse 5, Paul is assuming or working with the assumption that the virtue of self-control is going to be in short supply. He assumes, and maybe he's particularly thinking of the wild and crazy Corinthians, that self-control is going to be a problem. Assuming that self-control is going to be a problem, he addresses the situation to the other party and says the solution is stop depriving one another. Don't take authority over your own sexuality. Recognize that your spouse has authority over your own sexuality, and so give yourself freely to one another. And although I know of a few men who need to take this obedience to heart and obey this and give themselves sexually to their wives because their wives would complain that their husbands are not, I don't know very many. But I know a whole lot of men who complain, or would complain if they weren't such polite people, about their wives' lack of submission, or sexual submission, or self-sacrifice. Interestingly, it's one of the few areas in which a woman is being commanded to love her husband. That is, to put off the selfishness that men are commanded to put off when they're commanded to love their wives. It is one area in which women are likely to be selfish, as if all the other acts of unselfishness give her an escape. But the Bible is very clear. There's no legitimate escape from this responsibility. It's a duty to be fulfilled. And once again, as we think about this, a duty to be fulfilled, we could ask, why did God make us like this? With one spouse sometimes so motivated towards an aspect of the marriage that the other spouse is not particularly interested in responding to. One answer, why did God make us like this, was He didn't, sin did. But we can go beyond that and undo the damage imagine undoing the damage that sin has done, and answer the question secondly. Why did God make us like this? Well, He did according to His purposes, and His purposes all have to do with the same thing. His purposes for His people is to conform them to the image of Christ. Paul tells us in Romans chapter 8, verse 29, that we have been predestined to be conformed to the image of Christ. And that word predestined means that every detail of life, from the hairs on our head to the cells in our body to the nerve endings on our skin, all have to do with the same thing. God's destiny for His people is to become like Christ. And I would like to suggest tonight that one of the reasons why God has created this potential conflict in marriage, which He addresses by these virtues, is to give us insight into the most significant part of life, which is the very possibility of our becoming like Christ. And I'd like to suggest that the marriage analogy in Ephesians chapter 5, the picture of Christ and the church in a husband's love for his wife and his wife's response, gives every couple an intimate opportunity to understand something about what is going on between every church's relationship to Christ and every individual Christian's relationship to Christ. Think about it this way. The typical husband and typical wife in a typical marriage in which the quantity-quality debate is going on, and the woman needs to be more giving to her husband than she is, more submissive to her husband than she is on a sexual level, and the husband needs to be more self-controlled than he is. And what they are doing is acting out the relationship between Christ and the church. For the intimacy that's possible in marriage, the sexual oneness that comes through intercourse, is a graphic picture of what Christ is looking for in his relationship with us. It's too graphic to use in any kind of public setting. But when a husband and wife are one in intercourse, they have achieved a oneness which symbolizes the oneness that Christ wants to attain with all of us on a spiritual level. Jesus Christ wants to be one with us. His prayer for the unity of the church and his prayer for the whole slant of Scripture towards Christ dwelling deep within us is symbolized in a very graphic way by the act of intercourse. So a man wanting to be friendly with his wife, whether he means to be symbolic about it at all, is symbolizing Christ in his desire for intimacy with us. And a woman's typical response, which might have to do with being tired, it might have to do with having a headache, it might have to do with being constipated, it might have to do with just wanting a good night's sleep for a change starting early, it might have to do with the fact that no one's had a bath recently, it might have to do with the fact that no one's been very nice to anybody lately, it might have to do with the fact that there's kids down the hall, or it might have to do with the fact that the mother-in-law is down the hall, or it might have to do with who knows what else. The woman's reluctance to respond to the husband's interest is a symbolic working out of your typical Christian's reluctance to be one with Christ. See, often Jesus Christ calls us into a oneness that we have no appetite for. He says, come along with me. Be one with me. He calls us into experiences of worship. He calls us into experiences of service. He calls us into experiences of sacrifice. He calls us into experiences of trust and obedience, which would make us more one with him than we are. And over again, when we don't want to worship, when we don't want to serve, when we don't want to submit, when we don't want to trust and obey, we are like a wife who says, really? I don't think so. I'm not really feeling like it. So Christ plays the part of the eager husband, and we often play the part of the reluctant bride. Now there is a moment in many marriages, after intercourse has happened, all being well, and the experience being very satisfying, when the formerly reluctant woman admits to the amorous husband, this wasn't a half-bad idea at all. If everything goes well, there can be a little chuckle at the end of it all. If it starts out with only one person being interested, probably the man is the interested one. If it starts out with one person being uninterested, probably the woman is the uninterested one. If it's the woman's turn to be virtuous, and so she decides to be submissive or sexually self-sacrificing, and they go ahead with the whole thing, and it's mutually satisfying, at the end of the whole experience, they can agree, this was a good idea. And the woman can defer to the man and say, yes, this was a worthwhile use of time after all, dear, although I doubt she'd put it in exactly those terms or those tones. Similarly, by analogy, there's many times in our Christian life where we didn't feel like going to worship God, or we didn't feel like serving him, we didn't feel like trusting and obeying him. But after the experience of trusting and obeying him, and an intimacy has been achieved, there's that warm moment in our relationship with Christ where we admit that he was right all along, that it was a good thing to be more one than we were. And if the Christian is not submissive to the Lord and decides not to go along with his ideas for intimacy and doesn't get intimate, then that experience is never realized. So I think that every one of us down here on planet Earth in the 1990s, going through the ups and downs of our marriages, going through the high times and the low times, is whether whether we know it or not, acting out a parody of the relationship between Christ and the church. Why did God make us this way? One reason God made us this way is so that we would understand what is going on between us in our relationship to Christ and Christ in his relationship to us. And I just need to say that the whole analogy breaks down miserably, and can break down miserably on a couple of levels. I mean, I'm talking about the fact that there's intimacy to be achieved, which often a woman would be reluctant to bother with, but which both of them should be glad they bothered with when they get around to bothering about it. The analogy will break down if the couple does not know how to communicate well. Communication is by far the most important sexual skill. Being able to say what is pleasurable and what's not pleasurable, being able to respectfully talk about each other's abilities is a real important part of sex. By far the most important sexual technique is the technique of being able to talk about what you're experiencing or communicate in some way. If words fail you, good communication is necessary. The other very necessary factor in a marriage, without which the analogy will break down, is that the husband, let me put it that the husband needs to know what he's doing. There's lots of room for a clumsy woman lover, but there's no room for a clumsy male lover. The husband needs to know what he's doing. To a large degree, in most marriages, it is the husband's initiative anyway. And if the husband initiates and does it badly, if the husband is not good at this and doesn't know how to please his wife, how to give his wife any pleasure, then there'll never be that happy moment at the end where the woman agrees with the man that this was a good idea. You know, at the end she'll say, I told you this was a waste of time, and I told you this was bad, and she tells herself, we shouldn't do this anymore. So as much as talking is the important thing and obedience to God is the real issue, there is a place for learning technique. There is a place for the technical details of lovemaking. And with that in mind, let me recommend in a small voice some books on the subject. I'm not particularly inclined to buy a very strong end table to hold up stacks and stacks of books. And I don't believe in hooks in the ceiling so you can pull down flow charts and follow dance step routines and all that. It's not supposed to be like that. But on the other hand, if a little bit of practical education on how to go about achieving an orgasm in a woman is a help, then here are some books that talk about such things. The easiest book to find, and by far I think the best overview, is the book called The Act of Marriage by Tim and Beverly LaHaye. It's written by a pastor and his wife. It was written quite a while ago. Now it probably sounds hokey and corny in some of its details. I'm quite sure it does because it did when I first read it. But it's a good practical overview book on a technical level. This is not a book to show your teenage children. This is not even a book to read yourself if you don't have a healthy marriage partner handy. On a more therapeutic level, there's a book called Intended for Pleasure by a doctor and his wife whose surname is Wheat. And there's an interesting difference between the book written by the pastor and his wife and the book written by the doctor and his wife. The doctor has obviously dealt with a lot of dysfunctional people. So this book, Intended for Pleasure, is very oriented towards sexual dysfunction. So much so that I hardly recommend it to couples that don't have dysfunctions because they would probably discover some in the reading of the book. I don't at all like recommending that book to people in the pre-married state because they're going to assume and look for all kinds of problems that they might be better not even imagining. But on the other hand, in the course of a marriage, if there is sexual dysfunction of some sort, it's a book that can help. And then, interestingly, a book written by a Mennonite and his wife named The Gift of Sex has a very therapeutic tone to it. So LaHaye gives the overview and Wheat gives the remedial lessons. And then the Mennonite and his wife, I think they're sociologists actually, but it's fascinating to me that they're Mennonites, is a book that gives a sort of therapeutic, it's sort of like, well, it's group therapy, but there's only two in the group. And it's called The Gift of Sex, and it certainly makes interesting reading. All right, there's two specific virtues to address the basic problem. And then let me go on from that and issue two necessary commitments as challenges, one to the man and one to the woman. Ladies first. If a husband and wife are going to earnestly strive to understand each other, if they're going to see sex in their marriage as more than just a means of populating the earth and preventing immorality, that is, if they're going to take on from the Bible the perspective that sex is a way to promote intimacy, and they're going to strive to be virtuous towards one another and make this an actual source of intimacy in their marriage, then it's absolutely important that the woman does one thing that is not logically safe, never mind. That's not easy. Okay, the commitment that the woman must make, the challenge that I give to the women to make, is to take your husband's passion seriously. Here's what I'm getting at. Let me get right to the point, and then you'll see why I was blundering because I couldn't figure out what to say about it. You must take your husband's passion seriously. Here's the problem. When a woman grasps the fact that a man's sexuality is primarily a physical appetite, it's very easy for her to see it in an impersonal way. She can think to herself, my husband wants to have sex with me because he's got this appetite that just doesn't quit. Fine. Then she starts thinking about this appetite that doesn't quit. It becomes very obvious to a woman that this appetite is stimulated by sight, because unless she intentionally gets ugly, he thinks about his interest in her. So then she gets thinking about the fact that if she is more attractive to him than normal, he's even more interested in her. It's a short leap of logic to the next step, which is to say, if the short leap of logic for the woman to say, and if I were even more attractive than I am, he would be even more interested. And then it's easy to say that women who are more attractive than I am would be more appealing to him than I am. Besides that, every woman is faced with the fact, I mean, every time we see our wedding pictures, we realize that we're all getting older. And however that alarms a man, there's a unique way in which that alarms a woman as she realizes I'm not the sweet young thing I once was. So I'm not attractive to my husband in the same way I once was. And all else being equal, I'm probably less attractive. The husband should passionately explain that this is not at all the case, but this is the way it will occur to the woman. So she thinks to herself, I was attractive to a certain degree to my husband at one point, I'm less attractive now. Meanwhile, there are people in the world who are as attractive as they ever were, and my husband can be attracted to them, since this appetite of his is an appetite that's stimulated by sight. So then it's very easy for her to take his passion impersonally and see herself as nothing more than the one legitimate outlet for this appetite of his. And she can say to him, if I were a more beautiful woman, you would be more interested. You're only interested in me because I am legitimate and as attractive as I am. And in saying that, she puts her husband in a very difficult position because, hauntingly enough, there's some truth to it. The husband needs to come up with a response to the woman if she serves him up with that line. But serving him that line is sort of dirty pool. And I'd like to illustrate that by talking to you about another appetite that you can both respond to in the same sort of way. Sex is not something that you can see the same way, but our appetites for food is something that we can see in the same way. So let's think about a woman's desire for food as a physical appetite that can be satisfied. And let's imagine, please imagine yourself, women, coming home one day from work or wherever you were for the day, knowing that your husband was at home doing something or other, and as soon as you come home, as soon as you get in the door, you realize what it is he's been doing. He's been cooking your favorite meal. So your nose tells you, and the sights in the kitchen tell you, he's been working hard at preparing the food that you love to eat the most. So women, you have this physical appetite, and he is about to satisfy it. This is an analogy. So you sit down at the dining room table, and he's even got the placemats out. How thoughtful. And he's doing this up big, right? There's china, there's crystal, there's the whole thing. And you're very hungry, and it's your favorite food. So just as you're about to dig into this meal that he has no doubt lovingly and symbolically prepared for you, you hear a funny little noise coming from his mouth, and you say, what's the matter? And he says, nothing. And you say, what do you mean, nothing? And he says, oh, I'm just being silly. Never mind. Well, you realize that it would be not right to just jump into the meal. So you put the fork and the knife down with great self-control, and you put the serviette back up on the table, and you say, we should talk. What's bugging you, dear? And he says, I just had an awful thought. I just realized that if some other man had cooked this meal, you'd still want to eat it. And the woman would think to herself, I wish he hadn't raised this point right now. Because what she wants to do is eat the food. But what should she do? Well, all she can do is explain that although it's true that she has this capacity to enjoy other men's cooking, the fact that you cooked it for her has not escaped, the significance of you cooking it for her has not escaped her attention. And she's reading into your slaving over a hot stove all afternoon and finding the china. Great significance. She's reading into the fact that you're willing to devote this sort of time to her culinary delights. Great significance. She assures her husband that she's taking his cooking seriously. And if he goes for it, if he's willing to take her interest in his food seriously, then the meal can be saved, and the appetite can be satisfied, and a good time can be had by all. And who knows what happens after the dinner, right? Anything's possible. But if he refuses to take her interest in his cooking seriously, the meal will be ruined, and certainly the evening will be shot. So a woman can say to her husband with some logic, you have the potential to lust after and desire other women besides me. And the husband, if he is honest, is going to have to say, this is true. This is the way sin has made me. He can say, if he's clever, that's something about me that both of us can hate. But he's going to have to come up with a better response than that if the woman will not take his passion seriously. I'm encouraging her to do so, to see great significance